Hey, I'm Julie Emerald, and I am a prop maker and a mold maker here in Atlanta. Today we're going to go over the basics of mold making. There's so much information about mold making that I can give you, so I'm just trying to limit it to the very basics because it is a vast, vast subject. There's so many things and variables that go into mold making. And so we're just going to cover the basic types of molds and some of the basic things that you can do with molds. So let's see. Here we go. All right, what is a mold? A negative impression from a positive model that yields a positive casting. So essentially, if you have your model that's like this, you take a mold of that object, and then you get your final, oh, sorry, this is the model. I made it out of clay. Then you take your mold, and then you get your final casting as your result. And the goal of a mold is to reproduce the original object in as close to perfect detail as possible. So you can see here, I have the original model that I used here was an acrylic blank. And then I created a mold of that blank, and then I poured resin mixed with various additive and color dyes to get this fun little sun catcher charm. Okay. So some basic terms for mold making that you'll hear me use a lot is a cast. A cast is the final object to be taken out of your model, such as this little scarab that I did. Your casting material, in this case, I used resin, is going to be any material used to create a positive impression from the mold. There are so many different casting materials. You can use plaster, you can use wax, you can use chocolate, you can use all kinds of fun stuff to create whatever you want. Keys. They're also called registration keys or guide pens. And they are pretty much the pen or key used to bring the mold halves or sections into alignment on closing or joining together so that they won't shift. It usually consists of a depression in one part and matching protrusion in another part. And I have a whole slide later that's going to show you some different keys. You can make keys in whatever way you want. And I've seen so many different types of keys used. Some people just use a simple like impression dome, like of a finger or a marble. Other people will use hex nuts. I've seen lots of different keys, and as long as it aligns the two halves of the mold so that they don't move around when you're trying to pour them, that's all you need. Okay, so the model is going to be your original object. Some people call it a master model. This was my sculpt. So that is my model that I use to make my mold, and then the cast comes out of the mold. And that's really important when you're talking to another person about mold making, because if you don't use the correct term, then they're not going to be able to follow what you're talking about. A release agent, also something really important to remember. It's any spray, liquid, or powder used to prevent the sticking of molded articles in the cavity. And you can use a mold release agent as well when you're taking your model to be molded. Sometimes you'll want to do what's called sealing the model, which I like to use Krylon triple thick crystal clear is my preferred acrylic clear coat that I'll use on like water-based clay or any type of Sculpey, because Sculpey has sulfur in it, and sulfur will inhibit silicone from curing properly. So you want to seal it before you actually mold it. And then it actually, that crystal clear will actually act as a mold release agent when you're demolding as well. Now that's only on the water-based clays, but when you're doing an object and you're not sure if it's going to release from the silicone, it's good to use a mold release agent. And there are different ones that are rated for different materials. Matter of fact, on my website, www.jemeraldstudio.com, I actually have a whole chart of mold making materials and mold casting materials, and then the mold release agents for those specific materials that are the best ones. So I actually have a lot of really fun information on there. If you guys ever get stuck and want to look something up, feel free to go bookmark that section. It's under my blog. If you hear me say setup or someone say setup, that just means the mold making material or the casting material is hardening. And the reason I mention it is because when you're doing a certain type of mold, such as a brush-on mold, you have to wait for it to set up so that it's not fully cured, but that it is no longer runny so that you can do that next layer. Parting line, it's also called a seam line, is the line on a piece to be molded where the sections of a multi-piece mold will meet in closing. Now, it's really important that you know how to find a parting line, and I'll talk about this a little bit later as well. And your cavity, so this is your parting line for this particular piece right here. See how it goes together? And I've done what's called jeweler case keys. So I've just cut them so that they create their own keys and lock in together like that. And that's my parting line. And then this is my mold cavity where I pour my resin. But its technical term is a depression in a mold, the space inside a mold where a casting medium is poured, and the molded article, which forms the outer surface of the molded article, often referred to as the die, is also the space between the matched molds. That's kind of a little bit more technical. I probably should have taken that last part of the sentence off, but yeah. Okay, so your basic types of molds are flat molds and impression or press molds. They're one-piece molds, kind of like this, just little flat molds. You have one-part block molds that are like this, which is it's a little bit different than a flat mold, but it doesn't have lines cut in it, so you can demold it by stretching the silicone and pulling the item out. And then split molds, like the scarab I just showed you guys. Split molds also include glove molds and jeweler's case molds. This particular one, because it's a block, it needed a jeweler's case cutting, and I'll show you how to do that. And then the glove mold I'm going to talk about as well. But you can do these types of mold for either one piece or multiple piece. So sometimes you have a glove mold that has multiple slits, and then sometimes you only need one. So it just depends on the object that you're going to be molding. A two-part block mold, you can also do, again, I think the maximum I did was a 7-part mold, but I know someone that did a 23-part mold. Like, you can do as many different parts as you are able to do to get something molded correctly, and then get that object out again. Sometimes a lot more math goes into these multi-part molds than you realize, but you can start out with 2-part molds and then move up from there. And then mother molds, also called mold shells or mother shells, and that I have some pictures of, so I'm going to show you guys some of that too. Okay, so an impression mold is really easy. I'm sure everybody did this as kids. You take a block of clay and you stick your hand in it, and then you get a mold. You can do it with leaves. It's really common for people to do this type of mold with concrete or rubber stamps or just all kinds of stuff. It's very simple, very basic. That's your basic mold. Flat mold is a little bit more complex. It's usually something that's poured into a cavity. So you can see here, I don't know if you can see the mouse moving, but you can see here on these makeup appliance molds, I have made a cavity out of clay, and then I'll be pouring that cavity. And then I will have a positive impression, or sorry, a negative impression of those makeup appliances that I will then put silicone into as my final casting. Block molds, they're a little bit bigger than flat molds. And you can use them, you can see here, this is a food mold. You can use much larger block molds. You can see this one over here is quite big. The only downside to making larger block molds is it uses a lot of silicone, and silicone is expensive. So you want to limit the amount of material that you're using as much as possible. Now, if you're new and you would rather have the mold turn out right, go ahead and do a block mold. But if you're a little bit more advanced and you want to try something new, you can do what's called a mother mold. And I'll talk about that in a minute too. Okay, so split molds. You can see right here, I have another example of a jeweler's case mold, and the more lines that you can put in, so I take an X-Acto and I open my my mold slowly by making zigzag cuts. And then I go back in a different direction and another direction. You can see in this image, I have like 5 different directions going, and it looks kind of like that jagged tooth shark's mouth. So the more keys that you can add, the better your parting line, which means the less flashing, which is going to be any excess resin material that seeps out along the edge. And that makes for less cleanup. So you can also see, here's another example with the little Buddha statue of a jeweler's case mold. This mold with the leiku is actually a brushed on glove mold. And you can see I have put the seam line with Sharpie here where I cut it so that I could get out my, my clay sculpt underneath. Multiple cavity molds. They're also called 2-part molds, 3-part molds, whatever. You can make them out of different material. The most common one for you guys is going to be silicone. So this is a silicone mold that's 3 parts. It was for, I think, a blaster rifle part. And then here's a horn that is it's clayed up, and you can see all my little keys and vent channels here. And then my pour spout right there. So that is the first half of the mold before I start pouring in the silicone. And then I will take the clay out and then pour the other half in silicone. But the key is to make sure you put mold release agent on your second half of your silicone, or your first half of your silicone, before you pour that second half, or you will not release and it will become one giant lump of silicone, which is not a fun project. So you can see here also, I have what's called a hard mold. This is made out of an epoximite material, or epoximite system. It's fiberglass, but it's got a gray coat on there, so it's nice and smooth. So I can cast silicone pieces out of a hard mold instead of trying to cast silicone in silicone, which you can do, but is tricky, and I don't recommend it for beginners. You can also see here I have some ceramic molds. These are called slit molds and are made out of plaster. So you don't have to use silicone. If you can get away with an object that is soft, like wax or clay, if you want to do another mold or another sculpt from your clay, you can actually pour it into plaster and then remove it, and then you have your object to sculpt on. Okay. So here are the mother molds that I was talking about. A mother mold is when you have a larger piece, you want to have something that supports that silicone, because you don't want to make a giant block of silicone. So what I've done here is I've made a whole bunch of pieces of silicone that I usually like to do between 1/2 inch and 1 inch thick of my silicone for my larger pieces. It's for 2 reasons. One is because the weight of gravity will start pulling on your silicone and will start pulling that down from your mold shell. And the other is because you want a certain amount of silicone just to give your mold the shape that it needs to stay in place. It needs a certain thickness, or it'll have warping when you try to pour that resin or whatever casting material you're going to be using in there. So these are actually a little bit more complex of a mother shell. They're called a matrix mold, which when you get to be doing these larger pieces, they're really, really nice because they're super conservative on materials. You use the absolute least amount of material that you need, but they're a little bit more complex to do. So you can also do mother molds by doing a brush-on shell, or sorry, a brush-on mold, like the glove mold I was talking about earlier. And then you do several coats of that brush-on layer. Now let's go back to that slide. So several coats. You can see that each layer I have done a different color. You can actually add tints and dyes to your silicone so that as you're brushing it on, you know which layer you've got, or what areas you've gotten and what areas you haven't. It makes it a lot easier when you're doing brush-on molds, because you need to do about 6 layers of silicone, and you want to wait till they're set up but not fully cure before you add that second layer or that next layer. Okay, so here you can see the reason for these mother shells is to support the original object. So you can see this casting here, and you want this object, the silicone that's in a thin, I think this is about a 1/2 inch around it. If you just try to pour your resin into that mold that doesn't have a shell, the weight of the resin is going to push down and warp the silicone. So that's why you have the mother shell to hold that in place. And undercuts. Undercuts are really important because they let you determine what type of mold you can make. So essentially what an undercut is any indentation or protrusion in a shape that will prevent its withdrawal from a one-piece mold. Now you can see with this bulldog mold right here, if you look straight down at it from above, then you see one object. You see all of its edges except for the bottom. But if you try to look straight down on this Buddha head, you won't be able to see under the nose, under the chin, under the ears, the neck area, and those are undercuts. So if you tried to pour this in plaster and then pull that up, the chin is going to lock in and you are not going to be able to get that plaster up without ruining your model. Whereas if you tried to pour this in plaster, you're fine. Now, silicone is a little bit different because silicone is flexible. So you can get away with some undercuts with silicone, but you don't want to get too many or you're going to have problems with demolding. A lot of times if it's a small undercut, it's fine. But if you get very small items like porcupine quills or something, and you try to demold that, you might run into some problems. So if it's like a mouth of a gun or something like that, that's really, really small. Sorry, I'm coming up with bad examples. But something that's very thin and small is going to have a hard time coming up like this without breaking. Whereas if you put a seam line there, you're able to open that mold and remove it fine. So mold boxes. These are also called cottles and retaining walls. You can make mold boxes out of a lot of different things. And essentially the mold box is the area that you're going to pour your silicone or plaster or whatever your mold making material is. So cottles are like these little things, and we used to make them in art school. You can use any material that's non-porous, and essentially you do an L, and the L always points away from the inside. And then you can put it together and clamp it together, and you make a really quick variable mold box. That's really, really great if you just need a square, quick, fast mold wall. I've seen people also actually make a box for a specific mold. See that here? Here's another mold. Looks like they've done cottles out of, I believe that's an acrylic. You can see on the side that it's got the clamps, and then they've clayed up and put their sprue, their pour spout in here. You can also use foam core. Foam core makes really great one-use mold walls. The cottles you can reuse, and the acrylic you can reuse. But the foam core, I might get like a second use out of foam core, but usually when you're pulling the foam core away from the silicone has enough surface tension that it kind of grabs onto the foam core and it'll bend. But when you're doing your mold walls, one thing that you do want, whatever mold wall you use, is you want to make sure that you seal the bottom of your mold wall, or else you'll have creep. And the sides. So see here where this gap is on the side of this cottle. And then on the bottom, what I like to do is I like to take a bead of hot glue and run that along the inside and along the bottom, so that I get that nice and sealed, and the pressure from the silicone or resin or plaster or whatever it is that I'm going to be doing it doesn't squeeze out the silicone or out of your mold containment. In art school, we used to have the new mold making students do their first mold walls, and it was always fun to go watch them, because invariably one or more of them would have a mold just start going in all different directions, and the plaster would come running out, and they're trying to fix it. And it, invariably, once it starts creeping out, it is really, really difficult to keep it all from coming out because the pressure starts going, and it's like a dam breaking, and just everything goes gushing all over the floor. So it's better to put a little bit of extra glue on there, put a little bit of extra secure, an extra clamp, just to make sure that you're not going to have this mold flood and like everything go everywhere, because that's a big mess and it's not fun to clean up. Okay, one of the other things I've seen people use is Duplo blocks. So Lego blocks, especially the big Lego blocks, I love to make mold walls out of if it's a simple block mold, because I can just put them together really quick. And I always recognize other people when they've done this, because you can see the little sides of their molds. It has the little Lego lines on there, and it's kind of a fun thing. So a couple other ways that you can do mold walls. You can actually make a mold wall out of clay, water-based clay or oil-based clay, as long as it's sulfur-free. Anything with sulfur in it, so that's certain plasticines have sulfur in them, so just make sure it says NSF, and that is a non-sulfur clay, if it's oil-based clay. And if it's water-based, most water-based clays do not have sulfur. I like to use, what is it? 210. I forget who makes it. I just go into the clay store and I say, give me 210 white. But it's a white body clay that has very low grog, or well, zero grog, and is just really easy and makes a really great mold wall, because the grog is sand that has been put in the clay to make it stand up. So you don't want sand to be in your mold. The one thing to remember, though, if you are using water-based clay to do your mold wall, is it has to have no standing water on the surface. If there's a glistening or a bit of water on the surface, it will show, like it kind of glows, or not glows, but like shines when the light's on it. Versus once all the water is chemically bonded to the clay, it has a matte surface texture. So if you wait for it to have that matte surface texture, you're fine. But if it still has a little bit of water on the surface, then that water could cause an inhibition with your silicone. So wait a few minutes, usually about 15 minutes, and the water will kind of either evaporate or bond with the clay. One thing that you can do if you're worried is you can seal it with the Krylon Crystal Clear. I prefer the can with the paintbrushes on it. Krylon makes 2 crystal clears, and they don't really have a difference in the name, but it's Krylon Crystal Clear, and it's got a can of paintbrushes on it, and that's the Krylon Crystal Clear that works best for mold making. I've also seen people do like cardboard boxes. I've seen people do poster board. I've seen people use just so many different things. And as long as it's a non-porous surface, you're fine. Now, one of the things that I've really enjoyed being able to use is my 3D printer. So now I can make 3D print. So this is a 3D printed mold wall for a flat mold. And I glue it down with the hot glue. So I don't have any creep underneath, and then pop it out when I'm done. So the second 3D print is actually really great, because I 3D printed the mold wall completely for a 3-part mold. So this is actually a mask. Here, I have it right here. So this is a mold for a silicone mask that we were doing for Corvid. And it comes apart. So this is the casting silicone. And then these are the pieces that join together to create a mold that you can pour your silicone, that's your casting material, in there, and then get this as your result. So if you're a 3D modeler and have a 3D printer and really like doing that kind of stuff, it's a great way to make mold walls. You use the least amount of material, and it's really fantastic. That way, instead of having to do a whole shop day of fiberglassing, for each one of those pieces, because you can't do them all at once. I just 3D printed it, and it was fantastic. Well, I had someone else 3D print it for me, but it was fantastic, and as a great time saver if you have the skills at 3D modeling. Okay, finding parting lines is one of the things that I have people ask me about the most. Finding parting lines can be a little tricky when you're starting out, but one of the easiest ways to find a parting line is to look straight down at an object and look for any of those undercuts. And where you have an undercut, that's where you need to put your seam line, your parting line. Now, what I'd like to tell my students is a really good way to start learning where seam lines go is to look at the cheapest toys, cheapest plastic toys that are mass produced, like Army Men. And you can see here this little line that goes along the side of the gun and the body. That's called flashing. And flashing is where the two parts of the mold, the seams, join together. But because these toys are so cheap, it's not cost effective for the machine or them to be trimmed so that they don't have this parting line. So if you look at these cheap toys, you can actually see where that parting line is and start figuring out how to find a parting line for yourself. And it's really useful just to kind of get your brain starting working in parting lines. And you can draw, a lot of times I'll draw with a Sharpie where my parting line is going to be, so that when I come back to an object that I've had to go away for lunch or whatever, and I come back, I don't have to refigure it out, or I don't put it in the wrong place because I thought it was one place and then it was another place. So you can see here on this hand that we molded that the parting lines are drawn. And then this is a like 5-foot alien head that we sculpted. And because we were doing a brush on mold here, we actually added, you can see in this orange section, we added an extra bit of silicone so that we had a thicker area for that parting line, which is really great to do in glove molds because it helps not only the molds join back together a little bit more securely, but you just have a little bit more material that'll hold it rigid and hold it in place properly. Registration keys. So I talked about keys a little bit already, and these are just lots of different keys. You can do them both by impressing into the clay before you pour. You can also cut, like one of the things that I'll do for my larger molds is I will pour excess silicone into some acrylic, like straight acrylic that I usually get, and then I'll slice it into smaller pieces so that I can add it. You can see in this first image here, that's what we've done. And we've actually made trapezoidal keys. And then you add it to the last layer of your brushed on silicone when it's still wet. And then as long as that original silicone is under about 6 months since it was poured and has had no mold release agent or dust on it, a lot of times I'll just clean it with a little bit of 99% isopropyl alcohol. Just wipe it down and then stick it right on and it'll attach. You do want to make sure that if you are using a 10 cure silicone, you use a 10 cure for your mold keys. Same with platinum cure. Whatever type of silicone you're using, use that same silicone for your mold keys before you try to attach it, or you might have some issues. So you can also do, so here, these are raised keys that I made out of clay, and these are impressed keys that are made out of clay. So you can do it either way, whichever method works best for you. And a lot of times I might even do multiple mold keys at once. One of the other things to keep in mind is that your silicone needs mold keys, but if you do a mother mold, your mother mold also needs mold keys. And you can see here these trapezoidal keys that are put into the mother mold, as well as where the silicone is going. And then again, on these smaller mother molds, here you can see, usually for mother molds, I like doing trapezoidal keys versus rounded keys. I like rounded keys more in my my silicone because I just personal preference. I've started doing marbles that are up 3/4 of the way. So on my really large molds, because the inside of that curve will lock in into the inside of the other half, and it will just hold together, and it's not moving anywhere. It's not going anywhere, and they're really great. And I actually learned that one from Rob Freitas, who's like, if you want to learn mold making, follow him on Instagram. He is amazing. He's one of the top mold makers in the field. His last name is spelled Freitas. Amazing mold maker. Yeah. Okay, so we were talking about the brush on molds. This is that giant alien head that I was talking about. Your first coat is always going to want to be thinned coat. So the silicone, you can buy what's called silicone thinning agent, and you add it to your silicone to make it very thin. Now, the reason you're adding this first coat as a very thin layer is because you want to get all of the details into that surface of your first layer of silicone. You're not really trying to build up height. You just want to get details. So sometimes this is called a print coat, sometimes it's called a detail coat, but it's your first coat. You do a thin, and you know the silicone will want to just run off. That's fine. Let it. It is okay for that silicone to kind of go off, because you'll still have that little thin layer of silicone that your next layer of silicone will want to bond to. And that's all you need. So once you have that first thin coat applied, I like to take what's called 5X. It's a thickening agent for silicone. I mix that in my next layer that I use a different color for. So you can see we started out with the orange, and then we ended up with like a gray blue, because we kept on adding different colors to our silicone so that we had a different layer, a different color, so that we could see where we'd already applied the silicone. Now, the 5X is a thickening agent, and it'll make your silicone hold to that surface instead of running off like your first layer will. And remember, you don't want to let it get fully cured. You want to let it set up so that it's hard, but not fully cured, because you'll get a better bond, and you won't have delamination where the layers come apart from each other if you don't wait the full cure. But you do want it to be not sticky anymore, because if it's too sticky and you try to go and put the next layer on, you're just going to pull up your original layer. I usually recommend 4 to 6 layers of silicone when you're doing a brush on mold. Your first layer is going to be thin. Your second layer is going to be thickened. Your third layer can be thickened or can be regular. And then I like to add a last layer that is a regular layer, so that any of the extra bumps, and you'll get just like where the thickened material just kind of raises up in different areas. I like to do my last layer as a regular layer, because it'll kind of smooth those out, so that when I make a mother mold of that area, it's nice and flat surface, or flatter surface, so it goes into the mother mold a lot smoother, a lot more nicely. So you can see here in this bottom, you can see that it's a smooth-ish kind of surface. It's a little bumpy, but it's not any major crevices or craters or like pimples that stick up. And then I put the mold keys as well, and that's when I do my mother mold. Also, one of the tricks that you can do with your brush is, if you go ahead and take your chip brush and you go like this to the bristles, it'll get rid of all the extra little loose paint bristles. And a trick that I love is you can put a little bead of super glue around the base of those bristles, so that when you are doing a brush on, and the brush on motion is kind of like a little stippling motion to get into all the cracks and crevices for the gel coat, and then you can just brush it on with the brush or spatula or stir stick for your next layers. But then you don't have little hair bristles getting stuck in your silicone and causing issues later. Love that trick. It was such a lifesaver. So pouring your molds, you can do a couple different types of pours. On this side of the screen, you can see that these are open face cavity pours. One's with silicone, one's with resin, and then this is with plaster into silicone. But these don't have a pour spout. You're using an open face mold, like a flat mold or a block mold, and you're just pouring directly into your mold. on these other two images, people are using what's called a pour spout or a sprue. Now, one of the things that you have to be aware of when you're doing a pour spout is if you pour and you don't have a gap or an area for your air to get out, you're going to get little bubbles of air, or you might not even be able to fill your cavity depending on the viscosity of your material and how big your pour spout is. So just be aware that if you are doing a pour spout, you might want to do an air vent. Or have, like here, I have a longer pour spout so that I can pour on one side and then have the air come out the other side where I'm not pouring. Because if I just try to pour straight on and my material covers the entire hole, the air can't get out, and then the resin won't go in. So just keep in mind when you're pouring that you want to go slower, slowly and methodically. And it's a good idea to figure out your volume of your mold before you pour. One of the things that I will do is I will fill a mold with water and then pour it out. Now, I have to make sure that it's 100% dry before I'm going to pour resin into that. But as long as I, let it sit overnight or wipe it down really well, I don't have to worry about that. But if you pour it with water, then that gives you the volume so that you know how many ounces of casting material you're going to need in order to pour that mold. The other thing that you can do is you can take your original model, say this is the clay sculpted scarab, and I can put it into a container with water that is already like measuring stuff. So like a little paint measure. And then the water is going to get displaced by the volume of your model. So you can find that really easily without having to get water into your actual silicone. So again, my name is Julia Emerald. I own J Emerald Studio here in Atlanta. And I like to post a lot of tips and techniques on mold making and casting on my Instagram and Facebook. So if you guys are interested in learning more about mold making or just seeing fun tips and techniques on mold making, sometimes I do costuming molds as well. So I'll post stuff about those, but I do a lot of mold making just in general. So love getting questions. So if you want to follow me, ask me questions, that's fine. I offer consultation services, and I have a lot of information up on my website, just mold making in general. So if you guys want to learn some stuff, feel free to check that out and look through all the sheets and stuff in there. I have so much information up there just because it helps me and it helps my students. So I hope you got a lot out of this, and I hope you have fun mold making. All right, thanks for tuning in.